Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we are going to start in the 1940s and 50s and discuss the early events of the civil rights movement in America. So, the post war period, as we learned last topic, brought prosperity to many, but many African Americans are not as fortunate. They're still treated as second class citizens. The civil rights movement is a broad and diverse effort to attain racial equality for these people. It compels the nation to live up to its ideals that were written in 1776, that all are created equal. It demonstrates that ordinary men and women can perform extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice to achieve social justice, a lesson that continues to inspire people around the world today. So first, let's talk about the two types of segregation that is going on. De jure segregation is segregation imposed by law. And you can remember that because jure sounds like jury, and it's in jury is law in courtrooms, and de jure is segregation imposed by law. Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s made this constitutional. So in the South, this is the segregation that is happening. Schools, hospitals, transportation, cemeteries are segregated in the South. De facto segregation is segregation by custom or tradition. Blacks are denied housing and even employment in some cases when they have better white counterparts, or even white counterparts to begin with. Sometimes worse, less qualified white counterparts get the job because they're white. This is how it is in the North. So de facto segregation is in the North, de jure segregation is in the South. Some early victories for the civil rights movement in World War II. It sets the stage for the civil rights movement because remember, Executive Order 8802, Roosevelt prohibits discrimination in the defense industry, and African Americans, once they get home, are unwilling to accept the discrimination that was going on before, after they were fighting to defend the country's freedom abroad. And a new civil rights organization forms during this time, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, who has the goal of ending discriminatory practices and improving relations among the races. They are a nonviolent group, drawing influence from philosophers like Henry David Thoreau and Mohandas Gandhi, who rid the India of the British colonists by using nonviolent protest. And so this is the way they're going to achieve racial equality. Jackie Robinson, you may have heard that name before. Just a little early history on him. You don't necessarily need to write this down, but he serves in the military during World War II in the United States. After World War II, he is not allowed to join Major League Baseball, so he joins the Negro Leagues. And the Negro Leagues were the American professional baseball leagues comprised of black players only, and some of the best players in baseball history played in the Negro Leagues and never got a chance to play in the major leagues because of the color of their skin. One of the last Negro League teams that still played exhibitions was the Indianapolis Clowns, who I believe were disbanded in the late 1980s. Jackie Robinson finally on April 15th, 1947, is signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers and makes his debut, breaking baseball's color barrier. He receives death threats about this. He's ridiculed and humiliated. This is all portrayed in the recent movie called 42, which was his number. In 1947, he wins baseball's first Rookie of the Year award, and in 1949, he wins the National League Most Valuable Player award. So he is a very, very good player. He did earn his spot. And today, on the 50th anniversary in 1997, baseball retired number 42 throughout the sport. So no one in baseball can wear number 42. And just a couple years ago, Mariano Rivera, he was grandfathered into it. He wore number 42 and he retired for the New York Yankees. So now no other player in baseball history will wear number 42. And it's even down at Parkview Field, I believe, retired there as well for Jackie Robinson's contribution to Major League Baseball. In the North, as far as what Truman does during this time in the late 40s, black soldiers are returning from World War II, and they are not as heroes. Black soldiers returned from World War II and were regarded as heroes just like their white counterparts. But in the South, they're still segregated against. And so President Truman does not like this, and he does two things. He establishes a Committee on Civil Rights to investigate race relations officially, and the committee recommends improvements, but we can't get them through Congress with the Southern delegation of people who are for segregation. And also, Truman issues Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948, which desegregates the military. All members of the armed service, no matter their race, religion, or country of origin, are able to serve together. And executive orders are directives by the president, basically issued to clarify laws that are passed by Congress on how they're going to be executed. And that's because he is the head of the executive branch of government. So let's talk separate but equal, or the Plessy versus Ferguson provision. Parents of racially segregated students claim that the separate facilities provided for them are inferior, in fact, and not equal. So blacks after the war start turning to the NAACP for help, going, look, this is ridiculous. These are obviously not equal facilities. Something has to be done. Thurgood Marshall is the chief counsel for the NAACP, which means he's the head lawyer. And in 1967, he becomes the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. So the NAACP takes some of these cases to court and begins to win some of the smaller cases against segregation. So individual cases. So Sweatt versus Painter in Texas in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, says that Texas violated the 14th Amendment by establishing a separate, unequal all-black school. And McLaurin versus the Oklahoma State Regents, George McLaurin is enrolled at the University of Oklahoma, but he is denied access to services like the cafeteria, library, whatever, and so that does not equal an equal education. So they get these smaller victories, and then they decide to go big and try a broader case. And that case is a whole bunch of cases wrapped together called Brown versus Board of Education. Brown is I believe her name is Linda Brown. She is forced to go to a school and walk there 3 miles away when there is a perfectly good white school a couple blocks from her house. She has to go to an all-black school. So they're saying that this is unequal treatment, and so the Supreme Court unanimously, which means all of them believe that separate but equal education violates the U.S. Constitution. So this is just applied to education, but it's a huge start. Earl Warren is the Chief Justice, and we'll talk more about his cases that he has while he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He overturns the Plessy decision, and the separate but equal provision becomes unconstitutional in education. But the South is going to drag their heels for years to come, and segregation and discrimination will continue for the next few decades. Another case that comes up that same year, that same term for the Supreme Court, is Hernandez versus Texas, which ends the exclusion of Mexican Americans on trial juries in Texas. Mexican Americans weren't allowed to serve on juries. But it also, a broader effect, means that Mexican Americans and all other racial and national groups should have equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And then the next year, they group a whole bunch of cases together, and they make a decision that's known as Brown 2, which basically says, okay, we decided this, and here's the implementation. You have to do this implementation of this decision, quote, with all deliberate speed. What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. That's just words. So my deliberate speed is a lot slower than Usain Bolt's deliberate speed. But still, it's vague language that allows the South to purposefully delay desegregation. And public reaction to the Brown decision, the Ku Klux Klan stages revivals. People in the South form white citizens councils that work against integration and put economic and political pressure on people who favor compliance with the Brown decision. And the Southern Manifesto is a official document drawn up by 100 Southern congressmen who vow to oppose the Brown ruling through all lawful means because they believe it violates the Constitution. Well, one of the first major confrontations was in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. They decide they're going to have a gradual integration, and at their main high school, Central High School, 9 blacks volunteer to enroll here, and they're all set to go. But on the first day, Governor Orville Faubus goes back on his decision to let them do it and uses the National Guard to block the doors of the school. So the blacks aren't allowed in. There's a white mob outside the school picketing and protesting the desegregation, which is the same thing as integration of the school. And so President Eisenhower cannot allow this blatant defiance of federal law to happen. And so he sends federal troops that stay in Arkansas all year long, protecting these students, escorting them to school, escorting them to class. And the senior of the group becomes the first black graduate of this high school. And so Congress, after this, passes the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which this is not the big one. There's a couple more Civil Rights Acts we'll talk about that are broader reaching. 64 is the big one. 57 is not the big one. All it does is create the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, which investigates violations of civil rights. And people in the civil rights movement were not very pleased with this. But the Montgomery bus boycott is one of the first major confrontations of the civil rights movement. Basically, Rosa Parks is arrested for sitting in the white section of a bus and not moving into the colored section when a white passenger wanted her seat. And so here's the story. Basically, you don't have to write this down. I'm just going to fast forward through it. If you want to read it, you can pause. A meeting is then called after she is arrested by the Montgomery Improvement Association's leader at Reverend Martin Luther King's church. And Martin Luther King speaks that night. He calls for protest but stresses that it has to be nonviolent. We cannot resent whites because that would teach them that we're not going to get what we want. We should follow Christian doctrine and love them. And he is then chosen to lead this boycott. And the Montgomery bus boycott lasts for over a year. These blacks refuse to ride the bus despite physical threats from the KKK and threats of termination from their employer if they continue this. King's home is actually bombed during this time, but his family was not there. Blacks comprise almost 75% of the daily riders in Montgomery, which means that the city is losing a lot of money, and they can't take this much longer. So instead of taking the bus, the blacks ride their bikes. They use carpools, walk, they hitchhike. There's horse-drawn buggies. There's even mules on the way to work. And after national pressure and after legal action is taken, the Supreme Court rules the practice of the bus segregation unconstitutional. And so it's a victory for the civil rights movement. And this gives Martin Luther King the national attention he needs to become the main face of the civil rights movement, at least the nonviolent arm of it. And he also helps at this point to establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which advocates King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. So that is the 1950s civil rights movement. Next time we're going to talk about the 1960s and onward, and basically the transition years of the civil rights movement. So I will see you then. Fill out your learning targets and have a good night. Bye-bye.